Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 43 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Today, we're going to talk about trauma and the heart. This was one of the first conversations I had with Curt. I remember Jerry introduced me to Curt at a local establishment, and I was learning about the great work they were doing in residential treatment. Using some technology to measure heart rate, and I got to tell you about Curt. About 5 minutes into that description, I knew we were going to be lifelong professional friends, and it's so great that's turned into a personal friendship as well. So I'm excited to share some of our first discussions with our listeners today, and I think really a unique and innovative way to look at data using biological readings for quality improvement. And I think what I hope at least is our technology gets better and more affordable. What you guys try to do with your innovation, our listeners might be able to bring into their settings as well. So hang on to your hats. This is, for a lot of you, will probably blow your mind what Curt and Jerry were doing. And again, I think a lot of lessons there as well. So as always, we should start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week. And I'll start out with mine. I had a great trip last week to Eastern Massachusetts. My first trip out to both Boston and Cape Cod. And I got to tell you what, I know we have a lot of new listeners from the training out in Cape Cod at Duffy Health. And what a beautiful freaking place. Boy, every minute I wasn't in the training, I was searching for another beach to walk down, and just beautiful. But my bright, shiny object of the week is right at the end of the Cape. I learned a few things if you're on the video. The Cape, what people do is they put their arm out. So everybody's got really buff arms because this is how they tell you where to go on the Cape. And so if you're watching, basically, if you think of me flexing, and as the boys can tell you, huge arm if you're just listening, basically Provincetown is way up on the hand, if your hand's straight out on the Cape. And it's sort of the end of the road. And somebody in the train said, oh, you got to go to Provincetown, because they got to know me for a few days and realize that, a little wackiness and culture was right up my alley with the beauty. So I had a great dinner on the way up, and I stopped by some beaches, and I pull into this town, and it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. Now the town itself is gorgeous. There's some monuments there because that's where the Pilgrims first landed before they went up to Plymouth. But the thing that just struck me, it was a different life experience. And I've been to Pride Fest and other things where for a few moments out of the day, I might be, as a heterosexual, a minority in a select event, so to speak. But this whole town was I would say probably 80% LGBTQ individuals. And it wasn't a special event. It's just sort of this town. And it was just a beautiful, wonderful thing. And it was just so, again, being white in Denver, Colorado, usually I'm not the minority in any sort of way, shape, or form. And boy, was it fun. It just it was so cool to be a part of that. And so the whole trip to Cape Cod, and also the training I did in Cambridge, I got to run not only on the beaches of Cape Cod, but I got to run around Harvard as well, hoping to absorb some of the brilliance in that area. So I'm pretty exhausted because I feel like I fit both a vacation and 3 days of training into one trip, but it was fabulous, both on the cultural aspect of it and also just the beauty as well. So welcome to our friends in Eastern Mass who are tuning in for the first time today. So had a great time out there. Curt, what about you?
I'm recently, this is kind of on our topic today a little bit about how we can use information to help to integrate groups. So one of the things that I'm working on, and this is totally a professional, bright, shiny object, it's not personal at all, is to use, I mean, interesting kind of population that I'm working with primarily now, which is adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I'm finding, of course, that that's a kind of a new area to apply a trauma-informed approach to. And it's pretty interesting to go into that and try and help people to think about things even from a developmental sense. I've kind of thought this for a while, right? That we're treating people with developmental disabilities, but we don't take a developmental approach to doing it. That kind of, I was like, how do we kind of do that a little bit better? And especially with adults, right? Because our thought of adults is development is past tense, right? We are developed once we're adults. So getting people to kind of think a little bit differently about taking a developmental approach to even adults, and that development happens for a long period of time and there's never an end point of it. And so we're using a couple of assessments that I kind of found that I haven't used before that I really like. One is called the Developmental Behavior Checklist, and the other is called the DASH, and I'm forgetting what that acronym stands for. But they're both really quite useful and can help people to generate things like a developmental age equivalent for an adult with intellectual and developmental disabilities, which is a nice number, right, to get people to kind of organize around. So how are we then tailoring our interventions to match developmental age more than chronological age? So that's been really enjoyable for me, working with a couple of new clinicians as well, which is always fun to do. So I'm having fun doing that.
Very cool. And I think that's something I found in the field as well. Sometimes with developmental delays or disabilities is we sort of think that that's where they're going to be kind of forever, and looking at it as a developmental thing, we can hopefully help people grow and accomplish new achievements in life too. And I thought that was a really good insight with that. So Jerry, I know you've been traveling around too, my friend. What's your bright, shiny object of the week?
Well, a couple of things. One is I had the great honor to go and play St. Andrews in Scotland, and, walk in the footprints of history's most famous golfers. And, the course itself is not very picturesque. There's some really deep bunkers that it's really tough to get out of, and as we'll talk about today, really challenge your window of tolerance as you're trying to negotiate them. But just to walk in history is really was really important to me as a golfer, to kind of check that one off my bucket list. So we had great weather. They're having great weather. The British Open starts this week over at Canusi. We got to walk that course, so that this week when I sit and watch the tournament, I can kind of understand exactly what's going on and where they're going. But the other thing I want to kind of briefly talk about is I just started a book by two people that I had an opportunity to take a class, Barb Mayberger, who did my EMDR training with, and Ariel Schwartz, just came out with a book that integrates EMDR with somatic psychotherapies that really begin to help people not only listen to the cognitive narratives that are going on in people's heads, but really to make sense of the somatic sensory markers that people are experiencing. Oftentimes therapists doing EMDR or in other therapies are spending so much time listening to what people talk about and how they kind of organize their experience in a narrative. But really what we know is trauma lives in the body. And that really trying to kind of become attentive and attuned to the embodied experience of our clients is important, and they do a great job kind of outlining that, the theories behind it and some of the practices behind it. So I want to give a shout out to the both of them for their great work that they contributed.
Very cool, very cool. And I think that's a great lead into the topic today. So, Curt and I, Jerry, we ended our last episode. Somehow I got us to the point of thinking 20 years into the future. How would we sort of bring different sciences together to help people heal? So I don't know how I kind of worked that in there, but that's where I ended this up. And it brought up through that discussion when I was hoping to measure the connectome. And if you're new to the podcast, I don't have time to explain the connectome unless you want to go back. But the whole thing of using technology to sort of get physiological readings from people, because we know a lot of stress reactions, psychological reactions can be measured in different ways. I know when we had, when we were talking about mindfulness, we were talking about this, and it's been a kind of constant theme throughout our episodes. So I know, again, the first time I sat down with the both of you together, looking at it, and this is something that I was trying to do to measure behaviors at some point to get patterns to really help craft our interventions with the populations I worked with. But you guys had taken that to a different level. And Jerry, I know way back when we worked together in residential, we were trying to write grants for heart rate monitors and getting some of that stuff, but more at that time, the technology might allow the individual to get some feedback. And then starting to talk to you all about sort of what you were doing from a data collection point, and then a quality measurement point, not only with the clients, but also looking at sort of the milieu and the staff as well. And so maybe Curt, Jerry, maybe start with Curt, but whoever wants to jump in here, just talk about when we talk about trauma and the heart. I know there's been a lot of really cool research on this. Just give our listeners maybe why you thought measuring heart rate was important for a population that was struggling with trauma and a lot of the resulting behaviors we talk about every week.
There's kind of a thread that you pulled on to get to heart rate. At least that was my experience of it, right? That
an association.
Yeah. And I was going through a kind of a process too at that point in my career where I was learning something new probably every single day.
Yeah.
About what I was doing, and I'd sit down on a weekly basis with Jerry and I'd say, how do you think about this? And I'd get the usual, the question really is, and we would, he'd go off on another thing there. And so it kind of was a progression to get to, yeah, we should use heart rate. Like that's the measure. And two, one of the experiences I had along that line was going to a Bruce Perry talk. And he stood up there in front of 500 people probably and said, if you're going to pick one measure, use heart rate. It's probably your most reliable measure if you want to measure recovery from trauma. So there are lots of things that led to that. And certainly one of them was learning about the autonomic nervous system and sympathetic parasympathetic balance and the impact of both the sympathetic, which is the driver, the parasympathetic, which is the brake, and then you get into also the polyvagal view of things too, which gets even more complicated. But basically that's where it kind of got to, that you could start to use somebody's internal physiological state to then communicate that to a group of people around that person. And if those people had a way of knowing in the moment what that person's physiological state was, they could have a better chance of predicting what their behavior would be. That's kind of the basic premise of it. Jerry, could perceptions you had from us going through that, and certainly you can tell disparaging jokes about my process to go through that and get to that point of all the times you'd look at me and be like, why do we have to argue about this again?
So, I want to kind of go back a second to, Matt, when we were at the children's home, one of the, I didn't have access to a lot of the science at that point to kind of look at it, right? And so you're moving, as a clinician, you're moving much faster than science in some ways, because you're trying to figure out is what's going to help relieve the pain and the distress of the client in front of you. And you use some things sometimes to intervene that you have to wait for the science to kind of catch up to you, right? And so we were looking at using yoga and using music and looking at some of those things. But one of the things that was really interesting to me when I look back on that, and Curt, you can kind of, is when the children, the residents at the time would get dysregulated. The solution was always, we need more staff. We need more coverage. We need to bring more people in. And what I found often was that the more people you brought in, the more people were dysregulated, right? Having people around the youth didn't necessarily help us accomplish the goal. And so I began to think a little bit about what is actually needed for a client, a child, or an adolescent, or even an adult to actually make use of the resources around them, right? So how do you say that you have this social milieu, but the person is not in a spot to have that as a resource? So we began to think about what are the interventions we need to have in order to get the child in a spot to make use of that. And later on, as Dr. Perry began to work and look at heart rates, and then you see Stephen Porges' work around, and even further, you have heart math working on, the connection between the brain and the heart, is this concept that, and I'll let Curt talk a little bit about it, but this concept of heart rate variability. And Stephen Porges' work around the social engagement systems, that adding more relational support around somebody is not very effective until we can help that individual get in a state that they can make use of that. And I think, as really Curt and I talked about that, is residential care is a highly activated, crisis-driven environment that has incredible amount of resources available for kids. But oftentimes, we don't get the staff and we don't get the residents in a place to make efficient use of those. So Curt and I began to talk about is what kind of interventions or measurements can we get around the kids, but also to give the staff feedback about how to most effectively make use of their relational interactions. So maybe I'll turn it back over, Curt, to you to talk a little bit about heart rate variability and how we were thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we were certainly kind of focused around was how to kind of blend in the ideas of functional behavior assessment with also that behavioral function can change with physiological state. And that was an important kind of organizing concept, right? We would have these, and I think I got that real idea a lot from the work of Matthew Knock around self-injury and taking a functional behavioral approach to treating self-injury. And kind of what we started to see was that as people kind of moved through, I guess we could call it kind of a psychophysiological space of you go up the arousal continuum or around or down the arousal continuum, and your drive to socially engage with others changes based on where you are on that continuum. So you'd be really, really stressed out, and kind of your attachment system can get activated. Your drive to be around others to help co-regulate can become activated, and that becomes then a function of behavior. But then there are other times when that state goes really, really high and you cannot benefit from social engagement. Your body shuts that down. And then that's not a function of behavior anymore. So we had needed a way to organize that so that our staff could be able to predict when that would be available. When should they engage? When should they disengage and hang back? And so we used the ideas around heart rate variability, which were really key. We couldn't actually use heart rate variability. We used heart rate. But heart rate variability, I think, was an important step forward in the ideas of measurement around physiological, really the use of physiological information. So Porges's work was really I think one of the important things that he did that was really key was he took physiology and the physiological measures from being only used as a dependent variable in psychophysiological work to being an intervening variable in psychophysiological work, where you could use it to then be predictive of the output that would happen from the organism in any given environment. So we thought basically let's give heart rate monitors to children on the unit and teach them how to use that number of their heart rate to understand what was happening to their body, and then to use it to either engage or disengage with our staff. Really, we used it as, in the behavioral words, we taught stimulus control. And then when I see this number, I socially engage. When I see this number, I don't socially engage. And then we use that same kind of concept with our staff so that they could go, oh, you have this number, you need this intervention, or oh, you have this number, you need a different intervention. And it was a way to test out whether or not we could get better with our interventions by using that kind of intervening variable paradigm of here's what's going on with this person or with this biological system, and this is what's happening in their environment, and then how do we adjust the environment to respond effectively to that biological system, that person. Yeah. That was how I was thinking about it.
And the parallel was that we've talked a lot on these episodes about having the adult respond to the internal state of their client instead of to the behavioral state, right? And so in this bi-directional interaction, what ended up happening is the residents are learning to reflect on their internal state and make sense and different meaning to that. But also the staff were beginning to pay attention to the internal state of the residents instead of just to their behavior. And so they would begin to use these physiological signals as a sense that the behavior was a reaction to what was going on inside of that child. And so you began to see a shift, not only in how the children, but also how the staff were beginning to assign meaning to these behaviors that the children were doing it, and to engage in them in regulatory interactions, whether that be engagement or disengagement, as opposed to managing the behavior. Mm-hmm. That was really the ultimate. So there was an interactional process that was going on as we try to kind of shift away so much from these are appropriate behaviors and this is inappropriate. This is ways of kind of managing my internal states, and that my job as a caregiver is to help you to do that. Yeah. To kind of look at that piece. So that was
a great parallel to Dan Siegel's work on like the no drama discipline approach, like his book. That's a great book. And if you haven't read it, get it. It's a great one. Right, that's a great parallel to what he says, which is when the brain gets stressed and the body gets stressed, we move towards chaos or we move towards rigidity. Mm-hmm. And that the caregiver's really responsibility in terms of helping to regulate that person is to move them back towards flexibility, whichever direction they went, right? If they went to rigidity, how do we go a little bit closer to flexibility? If you went to chaos, how do we move you back a little bit more towards flexibility? So I think there's a great parallel between those two, as I was thinking as you were talking, Jerry.
So let me walk in, because we're throwing out a lot of terminology, and I think for those that have listened to all 42 episodes before this are probably on board with us. But let's do a little role play here. Let's say you're hiring me to come in as sort of maybe in kind of a management level position, and I don't have a whole lot about trauma in my background. And I walk into my new job, and you two guys are talking about all this stuff. And I see all my new clients are wearing wristwatches. How would you start from that I don't have any of that knowledge. I haven't tried to read polyvagal theory because I haven't gotten any of that. How would you start to explain? And I asked the question, why are all these kids wearing watches? Why did you guys spend all this money on these watches? And what are you trying to do here? So think about me as somebody who hasn't had a whole lot of knowledge here. I'm walking in. Kind of train me a little bit on what you're trying to do with this and how you're using the data.
How is this conversation different than any other conversation?
Thanks, Jerry.
Go ahead, Curt. You want to give it a shot?
Yeah. So
Because we're role-playing this time.
I'm going to put on a very, very behavioral hat for a minute. Like really behavioral. Because I think that's tying it to that can help to operationalize it.
Yes.
That's one of the things that my training as a behavior analyst really helps me to operationalize things. And so
you would start and make Jerry shut up for a while during my training.
Jerry nods for a minute until he's got enough detail, and then he's like, so really the question is.
I was hoping you'd start, Curt. So train,
and that's
train
my
me,
cue.
train.
That's my cue to shut up. So the challenge, right? We'll just go. We'll even talk about inside the skin, outside the skin.
Yeah.
Let's go back to that kind of concept. So one of the things that's really important is that I think we were talking about this a little bit last week, right? The way that I think about things and kind of view things is always looking for the relationships between events, which is a bedrock of behavioral approach. And I think it's a bedrock of scientific approach. We have to have events to measure and get an idea of the relationship between those things that happen. And so one of the things that's a challenge with inside the skin symptoms is that there is only one person who has access to what's going on inside the skin. So finding a way to get access to that can help us to respond to that person in a fundamentally different way than if all we have is access to what's going on outside of their skin. And so somebody may be like even take a personal example, right? So go into a meeting where you're a new person and it's very uncomfortable. We all can kind of resonate with that feeling, right? You're the new person, you don't know what all the rules are. It's really ambiguous. You're not sure how to behave and how to act in that environment. One of the things that we do as a kind of general pattern among people is that when we're in that situation, we look around at what everybody else is doing and we do that. That's the safest thing to do. Just look around what everybody else is doing. I follow that, I'll be fine. And I'll figure out the rules later. And so being able to then, and let's say that then you break a rule that you didn't know about in that social setting. And somebody says something to you about how you broke that rule that's really kind of rude and mean, and it increases this kind of level of anxiety that you have in that situation. If they knew, right, if they had access to your internal state, how would that change how they told you that you broke a social rule? Right? Hopefully it would change it in a way that was more sensitive to your internal state, and it responded to your violation of a social norm. And so the use of a measure of inside the skin doesn't replace what we know about what's going on outside the skin. It adds to it. It adds another piece of information that we can use to be more predictive and better tailor our interventions to what's happening with that person, in taking into account what's going on around them, what's their history, and what's their internal state, which we wouldn't have access to without, say, a heart rate monitor. Now, that's one of the. Well, does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And Jerry, let me ask you this. So I'm having a conversation with a kid that just broke a rule. I'm trying to hand out a consequence because we're this behavioral program. And how do I do it? Do I ask the kid, hey, what's your heart rate right now? How do I get this inside the skin information in a way that's practical when I'm working with my new clients?
So you started out by saying I have a program that's behavioral, right?
Well, there's the first dude's talking about all these stimulus and, you know.
I get that, but the issue really is behavioral was a strategy to do something, whether it was a dynamic intervention or a behavioral intervention, or it was you were trying to accomplish something and you chose to use that as your vehicle to accomplish. So I would ask you, what is it you're trying to accomplish? What is it we're really trying to accomplish with this child or this client who has come to you for some service? And the issue really would be is you would want to say is, I want them to be making, first of all, to be making choices, right? Having some ability to make choice, to be able to be socially aware, to be able in some ways to understand what their own needs are, to be able to appreciate what the needs of others, and to negotiate those things, right? Because that's what we're trying to do.
Sure.
All of those behaviors that we're trying to, in some ways, get our clients to engage in are mediated by the part of our brain that is most sensitive to stress. Mm-hmm. That when we become stressed, when we become highly aroused, we shut down, right? And we become much more if you want to stay with Dan Siegel's model, we become much more chaotic or rigid because we're moving away from a decision-making part of our brain to one that's automatic and reflexive. Mm-hmm. So that when we're in those states, consequenting somebody is not going to get them to activate the part of the brain that we're looking for, right? So consequent may be about getting them to stop doing what they're doing, right? So if you're engaged in something I don't want you to engage and I give you a consequence, you're going to go, okay, I should stop that. But in the kind of analogy that that Curt was using, if I get mad and rude to you, you stop doing what you're doing, but you have no clue what the rule is now. You didn't learn anything other than I did something that made this person rude. So in a way, the heart monitor is a signal to the caregiver or to the child that something has gone wrong, that something in my physiology, that I'm becoming stressed, so that as a caregiver, I now have to start, in order to kind of teach you something, I have to move to regulating you. So regulate, and then I have to reconnect, and then I could teach you something. So that if we use a sequence of engagement model instead of consequence, we're going to, in some ways, match our interaction to the state that the child's in, instead of asking the child to match my need, right? And so if you come in and you're working on something and you're working for me and you did something and now you're agitated, it's my job as your supervisor, if you were wearing a heart monitor, to realize that, oh, you're really upset about something that's going on. I've got to help you manage that state before I could teach you something. So it's not just the residents, it's not just our clients, it really is how we interact. And when we actually use that part of our brain, our executive functioning part of the brain, we don't know it because it's working, right? But when we're working with clients who that goes offline, we become aware that it's not working. So we need to be attentive to signals when they change states, right? And we could do that if we're calm and we're very attentive and doing it. That's what a therapist does, right? That's what a good parent does. realizes their child's changed states. But when we're working with multiple clients, or that the environment is highly arousing to the people working in it, we need other mechanisms to help us to stay into that attentive and attuned states. That's why the heart monitor is going to allow you to do what you probably do in multiple kind of relationships, but to do it in this highly stressed environment. That's really what the extra tool is needed in.
But when you go back
so my intervention is going to change depending on their heart rate.
Theoretically.
All right.
It needs to.
Because it's also going to change based on my heart rate. Right?
So how do I get this data in real time, though?
So the issue is that really what you want is you want people working with our clients who are attuned not only to their client's physiology, but also in tune to their own physiology.
Great.
Yeah. I mean, there's too, I was thinking while you were talking, Jerry, about one of the things that the neurosequential model talks a lot about is what kind of experience does this person need to have a reparative experience and change their relational templates. And that's almost always a positive relational experience with another person. And we need lots and lots of those. They happen to happen over and over and over again. From a conditioning and learning perspective, that repetition changes things on how that person now interacts with the world. And so having this intermediary measure was one of our, I think it was a great way, it actually worked pretty well, to get people to keep having a positive interaction with another person. Right? And we were missing that often when kids would engage in behavior that was really frustrating. I mean, it could be really frustrating for our staff. And so having this other kind of intermediary where the staff could stop and pause and have a way of looking at what this child just did, and an additional way of understanding what may have happened to that child can help to really generate this interaction with them, where even if they just a little bit more asked, what's going on with you? They just asked that question one time. It might not work, right? But if you're really kind of playing the probabilities right, asking that question is going to lead to a positive social interaction much more often than not asking that question.
Right. So Matt, you raised a really important issue, is that when we're switching from a behavior modification model to a regulatory model, it's very difficult sometimes for somebody coming in to understand that my job really is moving to help become a co-regulator of the states of the people I'm working with, as opposed to just modifying behavior. Because if we modify the states based on our change in states, the behavioral options change, right? But if we just focus on the behavior, the states may be driving the resistance to that change. So when you ask the question, what happens when I just consequence this kid? That's really the mindset that people come into that environment with. So by providing this mechanism, where hopefully it becomes a reinforcer of this change we're asking people to make, that to begin to stop thinking just about rewards and consequences and begin to become a co-regulator of these states for the client. Awesome. So it's a feedback mechanism for new people coming in that have a hard time making that, in some ways, paradigm shift in their minds about what is my role in this environment. Is really, I'm here to help you in some ways move away from chaos and rigidity and back to this integrated state.
Right.
Great. So what I'm hearing is, as this new manager in the milieu, whether it's a classroom, a dorm, whatever it might be, you're gonna help train me to have different interventions depending on the arousal level of the person that I'm working with. But you haven't answered the question yet. Is when and how do I get the data to know which approach to use, so I make sure that the intervention you train me on matches the arousal state of the client I'm working with?
I've done it in really kind of 3 different ways. One way, which is probably the most simple, was to have a child wear a heart rate monitor strap and have a heart rate monitor on his or her wrist. Some kids just hated the strap and we couldn't get that, right? So it was nice to have that one, in that you could have kind of a continuous measure. And we could also then, in today's world, right, you can upload that data. So you could look at changes in physiological state throughout the day over time. And that was pretty cool, because then you could start to plan around, oh, this event, like what's going on at this time of day, because your heart rate was really high right then, or what was going on here because it was really low right then. And you could start to plan out what events and be predictive of what would generate higher heart rates versus lower heart rates. That was fun, right? Because that continuous measurement was great. Other kids just did not like the feel of that heart rate strap. They just couldn't do it. So Fitbits they like a lot, although they're really expensive. That was our problem. They're just too expensive. So one of the things that we did to kind of solve that problem was to get a whole bunch of wrist monitors that had fingertip sensors on either side of the watch face. And what we would do is we would incorporate this into our positive behavior interventions and support system. We would take advantage of this motivational intervention to start to give rewards to kids for checking their heart rate and checking in with the staff and reporting on what it was and making a decision about it and deciding. So that's how we designed it, so that we were actually using this motivational intervention to get kids to engage in regulatory activities. And that was really fun. That worked really well. I mean, that was something that was actually pretty easy to motivate, in that it really captured a social reinforcer. Then we used kind of a contrived artificial reinforcer within the positive behavior support system. And that generated checking in with my internal state and then deciding whether or not I need social engagement right now. And that would, in that state, social engagement would function as a reinforcer again. So pretty soon you don't need that contrived intervention anymore, because the natural contingencies kind of took effect and you had somebody really engaging socially. And that was a great reinforcement trap, as I like to call them. The other one that we have used with quite a bit of success, and this is a lot with really kind of younger kids, is a pulse oximeter. Is they don't mind just taking it's pretty easy to put your finger in a little device and get a quick measurement. And we did that in a kind of a preschool academic school environment, where we started to test out. I had a great occupational therapy who really liked this intervention, and she would test out different sensory regulation activities from her OT background. She brought that in. She had a ton of options. And we would actually measure whether or not that event produced more arousal or less arousal using a pulse oximeter on both ends of the event. So that gave us an idea of what we were going to use as a sensory event to help to either regulate this person or to help them practice being activated and then becoming regulated. So those are the methods that and kind of some examples of how I've used the different technological options available.
Great. And Jerry, just a question. I'm kind of thinking about this now as I'm going to come in. I'm just going to start getting this data. So one of the things that I think I've read, maybe I heard this podcast some point where this doctor was talking all this fancy lingo to me. So will we have to, for each individual client, get some baseline data? Because I think somebody told me somewhere along the line that trauma and the response to trauma, whereas something might be high, heart rate, baseline heart rate might be different. And so do we need to get enough data on each individual client we're working with to really structure this intervention from? Or can we say that a heart rate of X equals hyperarousal for each and every person? Can we look at it that way, or do we have to have some individual data to work with?
So let's go back and talk a little bit about the difference, because we mentioned this and we didn't really talk about it, but the difference between heart rate and heart rate variability, right? Heart rate is beats per minute. So you get a heart rate, and say you have two people that have 70 beats per minute, which, right, 60 to 80 beats per minute is kind of average for an adult to kind of look at that. So you have two people that have 70 beats per minute. That's the heart rate. Heart rate variability is the variability between each of those beats within that minute.
Right,
Right?
variability
So
in
you
time.
can have some in time. So you can, two people may have the same heart rate, but there's more variability within those beats in that minute for one person versus another. And there's some research, Stephen Porges did and a number of others, that look at the variability within that heart rate is mediated by the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, which is the branch that's really the brake that's kind of regulating our sympathetic reaction, that's kind of pushing us to higher arousal, or if we're overwhelmed, is kicking in and kind of shutting us down. So that people with high heart rate variability have more flexibility, are more adaptive, are able to stay within that social engagement part of this arousal, that calm and alert level, more so that they're able to kind of engage in social engagement. They're able to make decisions. They're able to hold somebody else's perspective while they're holding theirs. And so there's a lot of positive behavioral and psychological outcomes that are associated with high heart rate variability, right? And so that when you're thinking about, do we need to, the best thing is if we had measures of that, but the other piece is that we have to begin to really have some observation and knowledge about what this data really means for our individual client. So if we think about it, is that if you just got data during the day and somebody had a high rate of, say they were 90 beats per minute during this period of time, I don't know whether that was because they got really agitated or they were really excited and there was something positive going on. What I know is that their heart rate went up, right? The way that I understand that is having some dialogue with them or tracking events to kind of figure out what was going on with them, right? But if I'm a trauma victim, I may be reacting to the increase in even though I'm in a positive event, my physiology is signaling me that something's wrong. And so I might be saying to this client, you're overreacting. There's nothing here because you were having a good time and all of a sudden you blow up and this kid blows up out of nowhere. You have no signs, right? But the heart rate was a signal. Even though I was having a positive event, my physiology, I've associated something negative with my physiological state. That I begin to kind of look at that, right? So if I track this data and I begin to see that you were engaged in a social interaction and having a good time in class, and all of a sudden you blew up, I could go back to begin to make some sense that a trigger for you wasn't that you were having just a good time, but your physiology changed. So now if I have an intervention, one is to help you understand that, and two is to help you regulate your physiology, I can begin to change the meaning and experience you have of getting close to other people or being successful at something, or right? And so that's where we take this data and we begin to look at the individual that's experiencing it, and then we utilize it for them. So you went from maybe looking at some collective data that, you know, these events kind of create increased arousal for people. But then I've got to figure out what that increased arousal means for this individual, and how this individual responds to these changes in states. Because we all have change in states, but really what we're trying to get to is state regulation, right? And so that's where this kind of work, and I think that was a really nice kind of way for this occupational therapist to realize, I just engaged this person, this other person this might be soothing for them, but for this individual it was arousing, but now I've got to figure out what that arousing means to this individual, that when I get aroused, all of a sudden that's a threat cue to me, and I begin to move out of my social engagement place to a more of a defensive place, because my body's telling me that there's potential danger here. So that's where, Matt, is you take this data, then you begin to look at the individual clients that you have, and you begin to make sense not only for yourself, but using them to help them make sense of what's happening inside of them.
Yeah, that's such a great example, I think, of, you know, using the data. One way to think about using data is to give you an answer to a question. Another way to think about using data is to generate other questions. And that's kind of what you're saying, Jerry, right? Is that you're using this data to ask a question of somebody that you're involved with in hopefully participating together with in a treatment process, to ask questions that you wouldn't ask otherwise and get information that you wouldn't ask otherwise, which is so important to the connection and to the healing process, that I think using data in that way is really a fun thing to do.
Absolutely. So you guys did a great job explaining why you did this. I wonder, after doing this, you know, and then this is, I don't think I ever asked this follow-up question. What sort of insight overall, having invested, I'm sure, a lot of time and energy and looking over a lot, I imagine a lot of data that you were getting from this, where you had the heart rate information for hours and hours and hours, weeks and weeks and weeks. I just kind of wonder, with sort of the minutes that we have left today, what were some of the insights? And if you've got somebody out there that's nerdy like us and like, ooh, you mean I could get heart rate data to get this data that could really drive programming and other things, maybe some lessons learned as well. So first part of the question, what sort of insights did you gain with the implementation of this program? And just kind of lessons learned and suggestions if anybody might be sitting on, you know, a few $1,000s of grant money and may be interested in buying Fitbits for everybody.
You know, I'll start with one that kind of surprised me. And now when I look back on it, I'm like, oh, it makes total sense. But it kind of surprised me in the moment. And it was a specific case. I had a really wonderful, it was actually another BCBA who was working as a clinician in a residential setting. And she was in treating a child and family. Child was placed in a residential setting. We were working on getting the child back to home. And so we were really getting in with having these parents, when we were having passes home and visits home, to use the child's heart rate to be attuned to her. And so we're thinking, you know, we're great. If her heart rate's up, she needs help, right? So go help her when her heart rate's up. When her heart rate's down, everything's fine. Don't worry about it. But what we found by going and trying that out is that it was the opposite. Right? So that when her heart rate was up, that was where she normally lived, right? That was the change in her physiological trait that was the product of her traumatic experience, right? So she just kind of lived at about 100 beats a minute all the time. And we're looking at 100 beats a minute going, oh my goodness, are you okay? And she's like, yeah, what's the problem? But when her heart rate came down, it felt very uncomfortable to this child. And that's when she would be driven to get activated. And she was trying, like when you think about the homeostatic part of it, there's the drive to get back to where she kind of lived as a trait. And so that's when we started to see that a lot of problem behavior happened. Was her trip from getting low to getting back up. And the way that she really kind of managed that and managed the change in her physiological state was to engage in problem behavior. And that got a lot of people involved with her. And she wasn't like, right? It was easy then to think that that was always quote unquote attention seeking behavior. Right. And maybe it was, right. Maybe that's one way to think about it. But it's also, you can incorporate the idea of that she did it to manage her internal state. And that really kind of helped the parents to understand, like we did a really cool thing with them that the child could handle wearing a heart rate monitor strap. And we used an app to connect the strap to their smartphones. And so they could see her heart rate wherever they were, as long as they, they were close enough in proximity to her. So they could see what was going on with her internal state. And we had to learn that when her heart rate was up, it's probably like everything's all right. Like you can kind of like let her be, you don't have to go check, but stay around. And then when it got down, it was like, okay, go. Like go take her for a walk, go engage her in something, help her to get her heart rate back up and manage that trip back up with things other than engaging in property destruction or really kind of challenging symptoms. That was kind of a surprising insight that I got. And now looking back on it, I'm like, that makes perfect sense. Like, why didn't I think of that, when we started? But that was fun to discover.
Very cool. Jerry, what about some of your insights?
Well, I have, I guess my insight is that, when I met Curt was a behavior analyst, right? So he had a way of thinking about the world and organizing his experiences. So as I talked to him, he listened to me through that lens. And that if I moved too fast, he would slow down and go back to trying to organize what I was telling him into his perceptions of that. And that I had to learn how to titrate bringing in information for him to assimilate it and Curt and I talked about this all the time, is that when we're presenting new information to people, the first thing they do is they try to fit it into a model they already have, right? So you ask a question, so what if I consequence this kid and I got to do, is like you're trying to organize it, not you, but into what you are role playing, is that, right? Well, that happens both for the people working for you, but also the people you're working for. As Curt can kind of acknowledge, right, is that when we're trying to shift the system, that system is going to try to keep organized by the way that it's already structured to make sense of meanings of behavior. So we have to titrate how quickly we're moving and bringing in information to kind of make sure that it doesn't in some ways want to reject or kind of say that just doesn't fit in the way we're working at it. So if I were to kind of bring in some of these ways of thinking into a system that was already organized under a particular way of thinking about it, I would do it at a pace in which the people can accommodate and assimilate the information into their way of organizing the meaning, their behavior. So if you went into a family and a family was saying, this kid is just bad, this kid is just kind of to do it, and you move too fast, the family is going to reject what you're trying to tell them. So you have to, in some ways, be aware of their states as you're helping them change the lens in which they're thinking about it. But you have to do that for the organizations you're working with as well. So as you're bringing this in, is asking people, how do they make sense of this data? And they're going to initially make it, like Curt said, they're attention seeking.
Yeah. And
you have to say, yeah, they may be doing that, but maybe there's some additional things that they're doing, as opposed to, no, that's not really what this means. This is what this means. So, I think really this concept of having a theory of change for both the individual you're working with, but also the system you're working in, is really an important thing that you should be aware of as you integrate some of these concepts.
Great. Curt, any last sort of thoughts if people are interested in bringing this into their environment, lessons learned?
I think last thought really is, I think people's kind of first reaction to it that I found is, wow, that's a lot of trouble to go to. And I think my message I would want to leave with is it's worth it. Like it's generated such great engagement between people, like both those being treated and those who are doing the treatment, that being able to help people stay engaged with one another and continue having positive interactions with one another, this has been very much worth it.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you, guys. I think this, again, it opens up another, I think, potential future direction of where, of another way to understand people and help people understand themselves, whether it's the staff, whether it's the clients or patients or students. And I think one of the most important, the heart rate piece, probably gives us more information than any other reading in a tangible way we can get right now in a lot of ways. So again, as we talk about innovation with trauma-informed care and how do we bring technology into our environments in a meaningful way, I think the work you guys did really impressed me, and I think gives a lot of future direction, and I hope gives our audience a way to think about, okay, well, what if we could afford to do this? What would this look like? How would we structure it? And if you do take that on, please let us know how it goes. And I'm sure you get a little bit of free feedback from us as well, as if you're looking to do that. So thank you guys for educating me as your new manager in your program. I probably lost my job already.
Asking such great questions, man. You're like the Columbo of this show, man.
I try. And I want to thank the audience again for joining us. Again, you can find show notes, discussion questions, links, and so on. We'll put a link to the polyvagal theory on the show notes as well if you're interested in that book, and in some other resources as well. You can find that at traumainformedlens.org. Next week, I want to tackle a topic that has recently, well, when I say recently, in the last year or so, transitioned out of my self-care trainings and more into my trauma-informed care trainings. And that's Carol Dweck's work around the fixed and the growth mindset. I think some of this research has really changed how I think about myself as someone who caught myself in what she calls a fixed mindset. And then when I started to look at the mindsets of people struggling with trauma, I saw a lot of similarities between her research and what clients that I've worked with were struggling with their own kind of self-thought, how they think about themselves in the context of challenges and other things. So I think some really good insight in there. And if you haven't been exposed to Carol Dweck's work, I really encourage you to listen to the next episode because it's been life-changing for me on several levels as well. So Curt, Jerry, thanks for another great episode, and we'll see everybody next week.
Thanks.
That's a wrap.